extra. These are free if you want one of these. We ended up finding a couple boxes lying around the garage and don't need them anymore. So you're welcome to have these, as long as you promise to be a good home for them.
Yeah.
That's what we talked about. Otherwise, let's do a few questions and do what that means. Yes?
Do you know anything about the Nora Baby Tower in Baltimore?
Yes, I do.
Is there any connection
It was built by the guy who invented the Arm & Hammer baking soda. So he built a tower that was very similar to the Newport Tower. He believed, he's also the guy who had the statue of Lee Erickson put in Boston. It's on Boston. I forget if it's on the Common or Common up near Mass Ave, right? Yeah. So he believed very firmly in this whole idea that the Vikings were here. He believed that Norumbega, which was the Viking Vinland, if you were, the Viking settlement, was along the Charles River. And if you know that the Longfellow Bridge, the one under construction now, if you look at it carefully, the stanchions are all Viking ships, decorated Viking ships. So he believed back then that, and Longfellow wrote a poem about the Newport Tower. But back in the late 1800s, a big move afoot talking about how maybe the Vikings were in the Charles River area. He believed it was in watertime. So he built a tower sort of at the 128 Route 9 interchange of Boston. So I've been there. It's relatively modern. It's 130 years old. Yes? Yes, sir.
Can you tell us about the author's process, the time it takes to write a book?
Yeah.
What goes into writing 10
Yeah,
books?
after 10, I finally sort of gotten a pattern at it. The first year, so Kim and I met we met in Newport, Rhode Island many years ago, and our first conversation was that we reached English majors in college and each one needs to write books. And so many years later, we had our first child, and we were home and not doing as much traveling or going to dinner as we used to do. And we said, let's do those books now. And together, we each took turns writing. So about 2 years later, respecting each other's need for time and that this wasn't just a folly, we each came out with our first novels. And Kim was called Papaya Myths, and mine was called Unlawful Deeds. And so that was sort of a fun thing to do with young children. But to answer your question more directly, I now have sort of a pattern. So every year on January 1st, I wake up, hopefully not too hungover, and I start writing. And I write every single day until I'm finished, which is usually in May or June. But I have a rule that once I'm engaged in the process, it's almost, you hear people talk about writer's block or whatever. If you write every single day, you never really get to the point where you can't pick up the thread again. And if there are days you just don't feel like, you're not going to call your boss and say, I'm not into it today, sorry. I'm not feeling it, No, you got to think of it as a job. And so just sitting down and even writing for 15 minutes, often that sort of gets me going, like, now I am into it. And 15 minutes turns into 2 hours and 15 minutes. Or if after 15 minutes I'm not, maybe I'll do some editing or some research. But again, it's important for me, to keep my brain in the process all the time. Stephen King had a great book. He talks about tips for young writers. You really have to think of it as your job. And you can't just say, I'm not into it today. It's not the way the world works. If you're going to take it seriously, it's the only job you'll ever have that they'll never pay you for. Like maybe you'll sell some books eventually. And after 10 books, I'm finally at the point where I've given up my law practice. But it took 15 years. So it has to be a labor of love, but it really requires discipline. I can't tell you how many people I know say, I've got the first 100 pages of the novel, and I said, top right-hand drawer of your desk? And I said, yeah, how'd you know? That's where everyone keeps their novels. But it sort of requires, the attitude that you're going to treat it like a job, even though it's a non-paying one. And then the other part about it is anybody here, has anybody here started writing a book or thought about it? No? Anybody? Yeah, okay. So do you think you have a big ego? No. You're wrong, you have a huge ego. You wouldn't think about writing a book if you didn't, because you expect, and I'm guilty of this too, there's probably 300,000 books in a Barnes & Noble, and you think you're going to write 300,001, and someone's going to walk in there and pass all the other books away and find yours on the shelf because you have the book that no one's ever written before, right? Okay, so it takes a big ego to think you're going to write a novel that someone's going to want to buy. Here's the problem. Most people with big egos have really a hard time accepting criticism and rejection. And really the only way, it's like the first time you tried to go ice skating or play the piano or kiss the girl, you probably weren't very good at it, okay? The first book you write is going to suck. it's not going to be any good. I mean, people think that they're going to be, that like the muse is going to sit on their shoulder and the first book they write is going to be, Hemingway or something. It's not the way it works. It's like anything else. You're not good at it the first time. But that big ego, I don't mean to pick on you, that big ego often interferes with the ability to take criticism. And so a huge important part of the process is once you're done, or once you think you're done, is to really give that manuscript out to some people that you really trust. For example, I give it to my mother, and she loves me very much, and I say, Mom, give me your comments on that. She says, I'm so proud of you. Okay. I give it to my father, and he takes a box of red pens, and he goes through and that's what I need. I appreciate it, Mom. But Dad gives me the feedback I need. And no, you don't. She didn't like this one. Okay. And Kim's a very good editor too, but we're at the point now where I give it to people whose opinions I respect, and I expect them and really almost demand from them that they be negative. It doesn't get any better by them telling me, oh, you're so wonderful. No, I need to know what didn't work. What did you trip over? It's my job to create a seamless journey through the story. If you trip over something, if you don't get something, if you're bored, whatever, that's my job to fix that, but I can't fix it until you tell me. So the combination of the big ego and also being willing to accept criticism from the people that are close to you, that's a hard thing. It took me a while to get my brain wrapped around that. Okay? And that's what makes it, I think, why a lot of writers do not succeed is because they have trouble having both of those things exist inside their head at the same time. It's a long answer to your question. Yes, sir.
What do you know about America's Stonehenge down in Salem?
Love it. Oh, one of my favorite. I said to my wife, I cremated all my ashes for American Stonehenge. It's an amazing site. I didn't talk about it tonight. It's in every single one of my books.
Could you repeat the question, please?
The site, America's Stonehenge, which some people may know as Mystery Hill in Salem, New Hampshire. Okay? It's an amazing site. I have a rule in every one of my books that the two, Cam and Amanda, the protagonists, they have to go to the Newport Tower and they have to go to America's Stonehenge. Okay. It is a site, it's called America's Stonehenge because essentially it's a calendar in stone, much the way Stonehenge, England is, but really the similarities end there. There's a ceremonial center to the site with a bunch of old stone structures, some of which go back thousands of years perhaps. And then if you, in the center of the site, there are standing stones, boulders, vertical boulders out on the horizon that mark the sunrise and sunset of solstices and equinoxes and something called cross-quarter days. That's the halfway day between the solstice and the equinox, like Beltane, for example. It's essentially a massive calendar in stone. And it's the type of place, if you go there once, you probably will not be all that impressed. I know the first time I went there, I was like, yeah. But I've been back there probably 30, 40 times since. We have a group going up next week, by the way, if you want to join us for the equinox. It's once you wrap your brain around that site, and I mentioned earlier writing books about Phoenician exploration. Many of us believe, and the evidence supports the idea that it was probably built by the ancient Phoenicians about 3,000 years ago, that they may have been coming to the Great Lakes area to get copper to fuel the Bronze Age. It's a whole other conversation, but the American Stonehenge site, it defies any other explanation. It's not Native American. I brought Black Eagle there, and he walked around and he said, this place is amazing. We didn't do this. And it's not colonial. There's carbon dating showing clearly it's not colonial. They found, they carbon dated a tree root which was found inside of one of the walls. And obviously the tree was there before the walls were. No one planted the tree inside the wall. And the tree, the root dated back to the 1500s. So there's no way it's not Native American, it's not colonial, what else can it be? So that's a fascinating site if you get a chance to get out. Yes?
So you were saying you were in a geological or archaeological group?
Yes, called New England Antiquities Research Association, NERA. New England Antiquities Research Association, NEARA, NERA.
And is that who's going to Salem? Or is that a different group?
So the group that's going to Salem is a lot of those people, a lot of fans of my books, a lot of just friends and family. It's basically we go and whoever wants to come along. We sometimes go for sunrise, sometimes we go for sunset, and then people like me go for both.
And how do you find out the information?
So if you want to get me afterwards, you can Facebook friend me, I put my Facebook, I'll give my email, but I send out an email. But we got a storm coming in next week, so it's an issue, but we go to the Newport Tower every winter for the winter solstice. We go to the American Stonehenge for the equinoxes and the solstices. We try to go through these things. Excellent. Love to have you. Yes?
Any ley lines that you're aware of in the East Coast of North America, do they play any significance to any of these articles?
So a ley line is a line of energy from the earth. So oftentimes volcanic fault lines, rivers, mountain ridges, they're considered holy by ancient peoples. They're considered to be places where the earth's energy is at its maximum. What if I were to tell you there's something called the Clinton-Newberry geological fault line that runs from Connecticut northeast up through Maine, and that fault line runs through western Massachusetts, and that ground zero of that fault line is where the Western Night is carved.
Where the what?
Where the Western Night is carved. It's that bedrock is what came up from the earth. So one of the reasons why we think that is holy land to the Native Americans, why they would have brought that group there, is because they consider the ley lines to be holy lands. Western is in something called the Neshoba Valley. Neshoba, Native American word, means hills that shake. We live on a fault line now. So it's a good question. L-E-Y, L-E-Y. Yes, sir.
How do you connect what you're just describing now, if you do, with a site like Machu Picchu, where they also are celebrating an apparently calendar and the astronomical?
Right. So the question is, how does this tie into sites like Machu Picchu in Central America, where they also have essentially structures that measure the calendar and the astronomical? I think the answer is ancient peoples were a lot smarter than we think. And especially ancient peoples who lived along the waterways that needed to get out and navigate the ocean. It was the stars that told them how to sail and how to get back. It was a question of survival. And so once you understand how the stars interact with the universe, it becomes easier to map things out and to predict. You know, one of the things that Columbus did when he first arrived, I think it was on his 4th trip, he was in Guatemala. The natives were uprising, and he said, because he knew astronomy, because he knew a lot about eclipses and whatnot, he said, because you guys are misbehaving, tomorrow I'm going to make the moon disappear. And of course, he did, because he knew it was happening, and that cowed them. So these ancient peoples, a long answer to this, the ancient peoples, once you learned how to predict the events in the sky, that became an incredibly powerful thing for you and your family. The priests that would pass this down to their children. That gave them power over the rest of the common folk. Those kinds of things, again, to be able to say, the gods have told me that they're angry and tomorrow's not going to be any sun, and then it happens. So those kinds of abilities, that kind of knowledge is incredibly important.
What's the date of Machu Picchu?
Do you know the date of Machu Picchu?
Sorry.
No. It's the Mayan culture, right? The Mayan. So the Mayans don't go back that far. They're probably only about... Machu's Incas, okay. So we're probably talking 1,500 years ago? It's not that far back. Yeah, it's not as far back as we would think. Machu Picchu's Incas. Yes?
Are you related to the Sinclair?
I am not. I am
How
not
did you
really.
get into this?
I have no horse in this race whatsoever. I give a lot of talks because it ties into a lot of the Freemasonry stuff, because the Freemasons are really involved in this. I'm not a Freemason. I'm not Scottish. I'm not Norse. I'm not related to the Sinclairs or the Guns. No, I literally admit this because I live in Westford, and my daughter came home in 4th grade and said, guess what I learned today? That's true.
Wow, it sparked something.
Yeah, and so again, 10 years ago I went down that rabbit hole, and time for a change of clothes. Yes?
Thanks to Jim Regato, I've been sucked into the series, so thank you.
Okay, good.
So my question is the 7th book the last one in the series? And if so, is there another series floating around in your mind somewhere?
So the 7th book is this one called The Cult of Venus, talking about ancient goddess worship. In ancient times, it turns out every culture worshipped the goddess. And in fact, my wife Kim, a little plug, she's a sculptor, and she's doing an exhibit down in Cape Cod in May, and the theme is goddess. She's got all these different sculpted versions of the ancient goddess. But to answer your question, I'm halfway through the 8th book. I started January 1st, right? And I hinted at a few things today with the Catskills and the Vatican banking scandal. That's a fascinating story. It hasn't really been told, so that's what I'm going into on that story. That's some really interesting stuff. That would be the 8th book in the series, and I'm never quite sure when do you stop and start a new series. I guess the answer will be when I run out of things to say, when people stop buying the books. So I'm still finding things. I'm always surprised that there was so much material, not just in New England, but this whole idea, again, that people have, for thousands of years, been using the oceans as highways to go back and forth. Yes, sir.
David, you mentioned that October 13th, Friday, was a lucky day.
Unlucky. So Friday the 13th of October, 1307, was the day the Templars, the French troops raided the Templar commandery in Paris. And all around Europe, they were all simultaneously outlawed and rounded up. But that's where the genesis of Friday the 13th being unlucky.
That was the unlucky day, okay. And one other quick question. When you do the history,
Yes.
have you found any history about the Brody family as you go into a rabbit hole?
I think we were enslaved once.
Thank you.
Interesting. So the Templars are outlawed. So the Templar symbol, because they had a rule of never leaving a fallen comrade on the battlefield, they would oftentimes take the skull and the 2 thigh bones with them for burial. And so the skull and crossbones became the symbol of the Templars. And then when they were outlawed, their fleet, a lot of their men took to the seas and really became pirates for survival purposes. And they flew that flag, the Jolly Roger. And that's the genesis of the pirate flag. It's the old Templar flag that after they were outlawed, they had to do that for survival. And then, and revenge too for them. More meaningless trivia. At some point you'll need to take the microphone away from me tonight.
My father was a Knights Templar.
So part of the Freemason umbrella of that,
Yes, and a lot of pageantry
Yes.
circles that. What is the relationship, or maybe you don't know, but the relationship in current times of the Templars to the Catholic Church?
The relationship between the Templars and the Catholic Church. Okay, I thought you were going to go a different direction with that. So, just recently, the Church apologized, within the last decade, for the charges of heresy from 1307. Okay. I think they probably were accurate. I think those charges were probably accurate. I think the Templars were practicing a version of Christianity that was far more liberal and more based on some of the Gnostic teachings of the French. I think that the orthodoxy of the Church and the liberal beliefs of the Templars were butting heads. So I think they were worshiping John the Baptist. I think they believed in the marriage of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. I think there's a lot of things that the Templars were believing in that the Church didn't agree with. So I think there was a legitimate cause to call them heretics. During the medieval times, during the Inquisition and whatnot, you had to be really strict about your Catholicism, otherwise you were on the wrong side of the thumbscrew. But as of today, so you mentioned your father was a Knight Templar. What that is that's under the umbrella of Freemasons. So you can be a York Rite Freemason, a Scottish Rite Freemason. Under York Rite, there's something called Knights Templar. It's called the Commandery. I know this because I spend time with these guys. I'm not a member. But given that those Knights Templar are under the umbrella of Freemasonry, and given that officially in the Catholic religion, Freemasonry is considered to be blasphemous, I don't think it's a close relationship between the Templars and the Church today. Freemasonry is still considered to be outside of what you can be a good Catholic. Okay? The Pope Ratzenberger, I forget what the name was of the Pope, he wrote that about 30, 40 years ago about how you could not be a good Catholic and also be a Freemason. Time for one more? Yes, sir.
You're going to take the jury vote?
Oh. See, the problem is the church was, I know you guys are all going to be polite because you know my mother. Part of the right, let's see. So I'm gonna word this. I get to do the jury instructions. Who thinks it's possible that Prince Henry Sinclair came here in 1399?
But as a lawyer, you know anything's possible.
I figure I'm not gonna lose that much. Thank you. All right. So thank you very much. It was a great audience.
Book here on the table, so if you'd like to talk to him, pick up one of his books. Has him here. One, thanks you. We hope to see you.